Well, Hot Springs, how are you doing? With all your healing crystals and spring water, we are always in a state of renaissance, rebirth, and rejuvenation, and reinvigoration, and reawakening to this bright tomorrow today. I have with me in the audience, or the studio, two people that I'm going to allow to introduce those.
Melinda Zarate.
And Melinda is here with
Mugabe.
We had Mugabe with us last week, and I have worked with Mugabe in many, many areas, and as a matter of fact, he has come and delivered some talks to many of the people that I know rather well about work that I do, and he does with the prisons and taking people into a whole new way of looking at the world so that they don't have to be incarcerated but can be liberated. And my foundation is called Clarion Call, the call for freedom. And we're going to be talking about a whole other kind of call to freedom today, a book by Dr. David Hawkins. And I believe, what is the title, Linda?
Power versus Force.
Power versus Force. And of course it has to do from, well, in all of our lives, moving from a sense of force to what we call in some of the recovery programs a higher power, or into a conscious connection with an intuitive spiritual state of being, which some people would think of as only feminine intuition, but if men can tap into that other aspect of themselves, they themselves can rise to a higher degree of awareness. I'm going to be playing a little bit, as I did before, of the piece called Carmina Burana. And that was a piece of music that Ken Kesey used in his trip cross country.
Elementi, amo sem materia, cinis elementi, similis folio decrudumenti, uns degni propri un viro sapienti, super pondere sede fundamenti, turno sego con parol fluviolamente, subio tramite nunca permanenti.
And we fade out on the Carmina Burana. I wanted to say that Ken Kesey played that over and over and over again on the magic bus that he traveled in from, basically, he started in San Diego at the Wind and Sea surfing beach there. I knew a man on that bus who had been a surfer. But they were mostly people who were trying to find themselves and another awareness through the use of a drug called LSD, which became illegal about a year or so after he did this. In 1966, September the 14th, it became illegal. But before that, I was at the University of California, San Diego. I was a teacher there, and members of the psychology department would come in and say, can I ask your class if there are any volunteers? We're going to be taking LSD this weekend in the gymnasium. Just bring a sleeping bag and we'll provide the food, and you can learn probably Chinese and German over the weekend. What? Well, it was supposed to be a consciousness-expanding drug. I was invited by a man named Alan Watts, who, with his very close friend, Dr. Robert Lynch had introduced Aldous Huxley to that drug, LSD, and took him out through the curtain into the final bardo of the Tibetan sense of dying and being reborn, using LSD. And we were using LSD with terminal cancer patients in the Scripps Memorial Hospital and reading them the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Curious how Evans Vance, the translator of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, was living in San Diego. And there was Dr. Robert Lynch working with Jonas Salk, the man who's, well, won the Nobel Prize for the developing of the anti-polio vaccine. But it was a time of experimentation, of mind expansion. The curious thing was that Ken Kesey had almost a worship of Dr. Timothy Leary, who was the Harvard professor, who had popularized the use of this drug and saying it was going to change the world, dropped out of education and became a sort of guru of the streets. And it wasn't until, well, fairly shortly thereafter that it was discovered that many people who used this drug actually went into, a psychotic state, went on schizophrenic fugues, that is, a little trip, and couldn't come home again. I have known of many people. I never used it myself because I was told by Ellen Watts and Dr. Robert Lynch, hey, Ben, you're right on the borderline. We don't want you to take this because you might not come back. But the point was that it was a whole new hierarchy of being. Here was this Dr. Timothy Leary, Kenneth Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. People were following the Merry Pranksters. He turned the Hells Angels on to LSD, and they became part of the anti-war movement. It was a whole upsurge of feeling against the war, against cruelty. And we thought we were going to be in a new beatific, blessed age. Well, it just didn't turn out like that. I was studying for a doctorate in comparative literature and the history of ideas, which was actually put together by a man, Professor Lovejoy, at Johns Hopkins University. And he was known for his discussion of how we always look for a great chain of being. And he talked about that having to do with the Middle Ages, the whole idea of the Roman Empire turning into what became the feudal system, and thinking that the Pope was the head of the entire world, and below him were the kings and princes and queens. But the great chain of being had to just carried on for a very long time after the fall of Rome, but even after the revolution of the Protestant movement by Martin Luther, people still, and they still today, think in terms of a kind of peerage. And they think in terms, well, in England, there is a queen. And she has, this year, will have ruled a long time. And under her is Prince Charles, and Princess Anne. There's a princess. Under a prince is a duke. Under a duke is an earl. Under an earl is a marquis. Under a marquis can be a count, and a baron, and a baronet, and a lord, and a knight. And then there's ladies and lords. Well, do we have anything like that in our American consciousness? Do we have people we consider to be, well, Prince, what a telling name that was, just died. And he was a kind of, and they used to refer to Elvis Presley as the king of what? Rock and roll. Oh, and there's a woman, a singer, who calls herself Madonna? Well, that would be the mother of the Jesus Christ, the part of that entire Caesaro-papacy, the great chain of being from the Pope on down. But we have in the South, and I have to mention this, there is an organization who consider themselves royal. They are called the Ku Klux Klan. And their leader is called the Imperial Wizard. They've also got under that the Grand Giant, and under that the Grand Dragon, and under that the Great Titan. And then there are Kleagles and Klukans, and there are Grand Kluds and Klockards, and it goes on and on and on. In the military, in which I served from the time of age 17, we of course start off at the lowest pay grade. And many people are attracted to the military because somehow or other they think they are going to maybe rise up to become an admiral or a general. By the way, admiral derives from the word al-amir. Did you know that, folks? It's an Arabic word. Oh, don't think about that too much. But admiral or general, and then you go down to colonel, and then you go down to major, then you go to captain, then lieutenant, then you work your way right on down, ensign in the Navy. You go on down and you have a sergeant major, then a sergeant, and then you have the corporal. Like Adolf Hitler was so thrilled to become a corporal and to win the Iron Cross. That was like our Bronze Star or even our Silver Star in the United States military. What is it we do to try and enhance our lives and to become better and better. And how do we do that? Now, we're going to talk today about the work of this man, David Hawkins. We're going to talk about some experiences my friend Mugabe has had growing up as an African American in a southern state, and the lady in the audience talking about what it is to grow up as a feminine member of our society. I was always goaded on to better and greater achievements by being told, oh, are you a man? Man up. Are you just a sissy? I was sent to a military athletic camp when I was 7 years old and brutalized. What happens in boot camp? I was a battalion commander in a boot camp. And men are they believe they've gone through a sort of transformation. But the real transformations, what is it that happens, say, with a boy who's from a very poor family in a place like Nepal, Tibet, China, India, and the family puts him into a monastery? Well, he can become a monk, and he can move up the ladder to become a lama. And, of course, if he hits the top, he's a Rinpoche, which is a reincarnated saint, or a Tulku, and in the Buddhist world could even become what the Dalai Lama himself is, a bodhisattva. But the way that happens in the Buddhist world is you have to learn to let go. The whole Buddhist principle is to give up desire and greed, and to give up all of your caring except for others. It's called altruism. And this, of course, I believe, is the most perfect manifestation of love, what we call agape, or the original word for charity, caritas, caring and loving others. And that's why I'm going to launch into my discussion with my two people here. Can we have some commentaries on growing up in this American environment? What is it that, first of all, motivated you, and what did you learn was probably an alternative that might actually take you up into a higher level, which David Hawkins calls a kind of enlightenment, an ineffable state of pure caring and compassion, which sounds like all the goals of all the major religions, doesn't it?
I actually grew up in what I would consider to be a lower middle class family of Irish, Catholic, oldest of 7, was raised by a father who was paranoid, schizophrenic, alcoholic, and a religious fanatic. So his hope for me as the oldest child and his first daughter was that I would decide to become a nun, and then he could live vicariously through me and achieve enlightenment through me. Well, I disappointed him greatly because I decided that what I needed to do was try to figure out a way to make an exit from the house as soon as possible. And I did that by becoming pregnant at age 17. And it worked beautifully. I was able to leave home, and I didn't have to give another thought to someone expecting me to become a nun. And I'm one of those people that has always been, I would call myself a seeker, avid reader my entire life, just fascinated by all things kind of out of the ordinary. And one of the things that I found just so interesting about this whole concept of power versus force is that most of what we experience during our childhoods is force. We're forced to do this, forced to do that, forced to learn certain things, forced to avoid certain things. There's just this experience of force, even though it seems benign. It's the way we're raised as children. And then we have to make our way out of that. And so when I encountered this book, Power versus Force, a number of years ago, and by the way, it was actually published in 1995, so it is not a new book. It's been around for 21 years. It was way ahead of its time. And I think really now, just in the last 6 to 8 years, are people able to even really begin to understand what Dr. Hawkins was trying to communicate to all of humanity. And essentially what Dr. Hawkins found out through 20 years of his research with hundreds of thousands of people over the age of 18 from all over the planet, all levels of education, all backgrounds, cultural experiences, men and women, all ages, was that by actually conducting a very specific testing method using people's muscles, he found that we all actually have the same map of consciousness within us. Now, does that mean we all achieve the same states of consciousness throughout our lives? No. But we have the potential for it, and that's what I find truly exciting, and that's what has inspired me to do the work that I now do and to be here talking to all of you today. So, and we'll get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I wanted to just say something about this business about how our muscles react to what our minds know. That Mugabe and I both, we probably, as young men, and as rather athletic young men, I still think we both look like pretty fine athletes, but we were urged on to compete in sports, right?
Right.
Because of that. And the way they hardened our muscles up were through saying things to us to enrage us or to offend us or to shame us, right? And Dr. Hawkins pointed out that the muscles will react, and we react, we respond. Yeah, we always talk about reactive versus proactive. Well, we had to go through just being forced to react. It's kind of like Charles Atlas, the original idea of dynamic tension, where he presses against walls and pushes against trains to build his muscles. Well, that's exactly what we were going through in our training in football and basketball and baseball, but mostly, and in the military, it's even, I took men, as I told you, I was a battalion commander in a boot camp, and we took men and we dressed them down, we tore into them, we shamed them, we tried to, I always find it amusing that one of the routines used was, what would your mother think of you? Well, it didn't bother me because my mother had been dead a long time, so you couldn't hurt me. But some of the times you'd have these very strong men go into a sense of shame and react by tightening up the muscles, fighting back, right? I'm waiting for my man Mugabe.
Yes, I remember growing up and a teenager at junior high school, and I remember when we were practicing football, and the coach would all put us in a big old circle, and you put one guy inside of that circle, and that guy had to bust himself out of that circle, and I could see myself tighten up. And when I tightened my muscles up, it was stationary me to the point where I wouldn't be off balance. He would hit me, and he bounced right off of me. So I can identify with the muscle, the reflection of the muscle, and being conscious of that when it happens, you know. And a little bit, and like first, let me give a shout out to KUHS, volunteer for this program, and it's just a blessing to have that here in the community. But a little bit about myself is when I became conscious of where love is when I was in elementary school and in junior high, and I was taught at an early age that love and being conscious of that would bring rewards. And all through my life, that has been a big part of my recovery is sharing that love.
Tell me what you mean by recovery.
When I talk about recovery, it's recovery from alcohol and drugs, but in life, just generally in life.
Recovering from that early assaulting, hostile, oppositional, threatening, huh?
Yes, and you know, as a junior high student going into a school where just integrated, and I was during the period of 1960.
Well, disintegrating, the law to disintegrate schools, to combine schools, was in about the time you were born.
Yes, it was 54.
1952, 53, 54.
Yes,
Yeah.
and we went to junior high school, and I was one of the first African Americans to go to Russellville Junior High School. And I remember walking into that school and all the hostility and all the tension.
How was that expressed? Was it expressed by insult
it
or
was verbal? It was
verbal?
It was verbal. Sometimes it was physical, but mostly verbal. But it was just the tension. I was talking to the young lady here in the studio with us. The muscles, you could see it. You in the facial experience. You know, and being a young man raised in the South, in African America, I was taught at an early age hatred wasn't the way. And so when I
Hatred is what?
It's not the way.
Yeah.
Love is the most important thing. And so when I went to this environment and I seen this tension for the first time, it threw me back because I could see it in their face. I was conscious of it, the eye contact, the muscles tighten up, and it was a strange. And so when she mentions about the muscle, it just bring me back to that time in my life when I could actually identify what she's saying.
And at one time in America, I mean, you see, I remember when Jackie Robinson was finally allowed to play as a professional baseball player. Before that, there was segregation in all the teams.
Yes, yes.
And then, of course, in America, one of the best ways for a young African American or a young man of color, of any color, was to get ahead was through professional athletics. We had some champions of the world who haven't our league. But before that, what? Joe Louis. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber. Yeah. But it was that this was considered, But then, of course, we have now a president of the United States, an African American who's a highly intellectual, highly educated person. Yeah. We're changing a lot of these ideas around.
Yeah, I think we're changing a lot of ideas. But myself personally, being conscious, once you make a determination to deprogram, I like to say deprogram yourself from these early teachings and reclaim yourself, it's a big step.
You've had why I consider you one of my greatest resources of learning about human recovery from oppression is that you have had the most extreme experiences of having been in the prison system. You were incarcerated, at Cummings and where else?
I was in Cummings. I was in Tucker. I was in Soledad. I was in San Quentin. I was in Folsom. All the institutions basically in the state of California I went through. And so, but I also became conscious of myself on my journey. But going back to the early stages, you have to remember I grew up in the 60s with drugs. And
that you also recovered from an addiction to drugs and alcohol.
Yes.
We had Steve Fettig on board here in this program, and he was sentenced what a strange sentence, 4 to 60 years for his involvement with heroin. He was a heroin addict when he went in, and he was able to get off of heroin, cold turkey, as they say, inside the prison in his second year. And then he discovered the guitar, and he started writing poetry, and he served 5 years, and he developed a whole new consciousness, right, in his prison.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But he was free inside.
Yeah, free. Being conscious, I'm a big believer in being conscious aware. And I'm just so grateful to be here today with Big Ben and this young lady, because the book she's talking about, I want to listen to her because it really fascinates me.
I want to hear more. Could you?
Okay, sure. I'll be happy to share more.
And I hope it doesn't sound like we're being sexist saying the young lady, because you look like a young woman.
Well,
and
thank
a
you.
lady, indeed. Gentile, gentilise.
Thank you.
Gentile.
Well, I don't qualify as young any longer, but it's always lovely to hear that I appear that way. The book Power versus Force, let me just give you a little bit of background on
Please.
this. Dr. Hawkins was an MD and a PhD.
He was a medical doctor and had a
Exactly.
PhD in psychology.
Exactly. He also was a brilliant researcher and had a great deal of respect in the educational community because of his work that he had done in research. So he based all of his work on some earlier work that had been done with muscle testing. And for those of you who don't know what muscle testing is, it's a very simple and straightforward way to determine whether a human body is strong or weak. And it's really just something
What is it called again?
muscle testing. It's also
Okay.
known as kinesiology.
Kinesiology. This is the way
Correct.
I know it.
Yes.
Kinesiology, yeah.
And it's quite common now. It's been proven. It's now 40-some years old. It's very commonly used in chiropractic offices, in alternative health care offices. It's now respected and proven. It's not anything new or far-fetched. So using muscle testing is a way that a doctor or even a non-expert can check to see if someone has some sort of a reaction or an intolerance or an insensitivity to virtually anything. It can be to a substance. People universally test weak in the presence of sugar substitutes like saccharin. Certain chemicals, toxic chemicals, people test universally weak in the presence of those. And what Dr. Hawkins and his entire research team found is that people test positive in the presence of concepts and states of consciousness. So, for instance,
Yeah.
one of the concepts that they began to test was shame. And let me explain how they tested. Being a brilliant researcher, he realized he had to come up with a scale of some sort to measure the results of the trials and the tests that he was conducting. So he used a scale, a calibration scale, between 1 and 1,000, with 1 being alive, just alive. And as they began to test these people, and again, this was many hundreds of thousands of people that were tested. So they introduced concepts, the word shame. And over, they found that shame calibrated at 20, which is essentially 1 step above death. So if someone is experiencing shame or being shamed by teachers,
It's a
parents,
truly moribund state.
it
just
is
above
it
death.
is almost death. It's
Moribund.
probably the worst thing that someone can inflict on someone else. And that's also why people who are in a state of shame are perilously close to death. They're often self-destructive, and they often commit suicide or attempt to.
Well, we call this often the clinical depression.
Exactly. So shame is just 1 step above death. Then next up on the scale that they calibrated was guilt at 30, just barely above shame. So when someone is feeling guilty or being made to feel guilty, they're not too terribly far from death either. Apathy calibrated at 50. And apathy, as we all know, is kind of characterized by hopelessness and despair. It's not a very pleasant place to be. Grief calibrated at 75, and grief is something that every single human experiences when they suffer a loss. The thing about grief is that if someone is in a relatively healthy state, they can move through and out of that state of grief.
Now, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about this.
Exactly.
And having to be to this almost the same sort of calibration but into
Yes.
the stages of accepting dying with some disease and starting with that with rage and shame and then
Yes.
moving toward keep on going.
There are different levels within this
This is
grief.
fascinating.
So again, we all experience grief as children, as adults, and it's usually because of a loss. And it can be a loss of a person, a loss of a loved one, an experience, a lover, a pet, a job. It's just that feeling of loss. And it can color one's outlook. And there's a level of sadness, sometimes even remorse, or even it can move into depression if someone isn't able to move through that grief and out of it. The next the next calibration was fear, and fear calibrates consistently at 100. And when I say consistently, I do mean consistently. Every human being that would be tested would calibrate at 100 with the concept of fear. So what's interesting about all this is this almost is beyond our consciousness. Once we understand this is the case, then we bring it to consciousness. But it's almost as if everyone has a, quote, moral compass built into them as human beings, which I find fascinating. That doesn't mean we follow our moral compass, but it's there. It's accessible to all of us. So fear at 100 is characterized by a worldview where things are looked at with trepidation. There are endless worrisome events, maybe obsession. Risk is limited. It takes a lot of energy to stay in fear. And growth is limited. You aren't able to think in a very expansive way if you're in a state of fear. So what's important here is that we need to realize that people who are in a state of fear, oppressed peoples, they often need help to move out of that to the next level up. And that's why no man is an island. We need each other. We need to have someone who will give us a hand up
For Whom the Bell Tolls,
show
that great
us
title.
a different way.
But that was that book, For Whom
Exactly.
the Bell Tolls. And no man is an island. But then what is most of the reaction to fear by most people is rage and an outburst. And this is a very unhealthy reaction. But both of them sort of
Exactly.
play with a chemical called, well, adrenaline.
Right. And fear has a place. It keeps us safe. If you're in the street and a truck is coming towards you, the fear is what
Like fight or
causes
flight.
you to run out of the way.
Fight or flight.
What happens, though, is that people misinterpret so much of their life experience in a fearful way. And that's the problem that we have right now when we turn on the television. We've got
let's
an
get to this, because
enormous amount of fear.
I want to talk about all of the factors in our so-called American culture or the world culture that contribute toward keeping us from evolving to a
Right.
higher state of consciousness. And television and music and the way we are sort of bombarded with what the Buddhist world calls samsara, the static of craving. I need that. I must have. Go on.
Well, the media actually loves fear. They promote fear. They perpetuate fear. Fear is very profitable for the media and related corporations. So they are going to continue to whip us into a fearful lather every opportunity they can. And that is why we need to be very, very much aware of what's going on with the media in that regard. So fear calibrates at 100, and unfortunately, all too much of the human population is in a state of fear the great majority of the time.
We have a kind of it's a stereotyped anecdote. Fear knocked at the door, faith answered, and no one was there. How do you look at that one?
Well, I think that people have a hard time. They have a hard time accessing their faith when they're in a state of fear.
That's it. How do they access their faith? And where do you go? Where do you go? And now the Buddhists go into a mantra chant, Om Mani Padme Om Mani Padme Om. Members of the Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous group say, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Well, and also families and cultural groups, communities who are experiencing a lot of oppression and fear, often they band together and they do things as a group, which helps to move them out of that fearful
That's what
place.
congregations are supposed
Exactly.
to be about.
Absolutely.
And when they meet, as I did this morning with
Correct.
others.
Yes, I think also listening to you and reflecting on my upbringing, and I remember back in the African American community, uncles, cousins, grandmothers, nieces, nephews, they would leave the South and they would go up north. But they would go up there, they would have someone up there, a family member, would take them in. But all through my education, living here in America and going through the segregation in the African community, we always had people that help us along, was conscious of what was going on. And so as a child, I remember even going to the segregated school, they taught us how to react, how to respond to this, physical, mentally, and spiritually, how to react to that. And so I can see how it plays into my muscles, not showing this muscle, being in control of it, being conscious of it, but recognizing it. But all down the line, I can see now by what you were saying, I can identify with that because I can see it, how my life was going through motion, all the support I had from a very early age that the oppression was going on and how to deal with it.
We're getting to probably the most important message, I believe, that we're going to glean and yield and exploit and discover in this radio program. What do we do? How do we deal with fear so it isn't transformed into rage? How can we transform? As Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, and I talked about him and I dedicated my Holocaust program to him, when he was asked by psychologists, didn't you hate those people? Didn't you want to torture and kill them? He said, I wanted to understand them so that it never happens again. Go with that one.
Well, that's absolutely true. If someone is in a state of fear, the only thing that we can do is try to encourage them and help them out of it into the next level. And that next level is desire. When someone is in a state of fear, they always desire something better. So desire calibrates at 125. And so you mentioned, Mugabe, that your family, you had aunts or uncles or someone else that was there for you. They desired to see you come up and have a good life. They desired to see you be happy and healthy and do well and experience goodness. So they were there to take your hand and try to help you along. And that's what is always required.
Well, that is what Mugabe even does today with his halfway houses. That's what I do with my halfway houses. That's what I do when I go into prisons and say, when you get out, you ask for Ben Wright and find me, and I will find you a place to live. I'll find you decent clothing. We'll get you a job. We'll get you something to eat, right? And that's it. But we have this extended family, and this is the wonderful familia, caritas, agape, altruism. Come on.
Well, desire, sometimes that desire has to be kind of given to us as a little gift by someone that cares for us. But once we recognize that there's someone else that cares, then we begin to desire something beyond where we are also. And that's what moves us to expend effort, energy, to begin to think that things are possible. And so desire can be the springboard, perhaps, to the next level. Now, desire can also be very problematic because desire is also that's the level of addiction, obsession and addiction. So if it's unchecked, it can be very problematic. But desire is certainly better than apathy or guilt or shame, as long as we're continuing to move up that spectrum of evolution of consciousness. So desire is something we all have, and it can help us take the next steps. Anger is the next thing that they found that calibrated at 150. And as people move out of apathy and fear, they desire more. It's just natural. But in fact, often anger is fueled by desire. Someone begins to look around and see there's something better, and they want that, and they're angry that they don't have it, or that their family members or their community doesn't have that. So anger is sometimes actually a catalyst. It can be a good catalyst.
It can be.
Unfortunately, it can often be a bad catalyst as well to behavior that sinks people back into lower levels. But the good news is that anger does have energy to
Well,
it.
it can also, as you said, catalyst, it can be catapult.
Absolutely.
It can be the springboard.
Absolutely.
And you bounce off that
Yes.
to a higher level, which
That's
is...
right. And so anger in and of itself is not a bad thing. It is what it is. And using that anger in a positive or useful direction can be very productive. And that's what I think needs to really be communicated right now. There is a lot of anger, and it's energy, it's pent-up energy that people have, and they're expending it, unfortunately, in very unproductive and, in fact, destructive ways. And so that's what we're seeing on the news, and that's what we need to
frightens
address.
me is what happened in Germany when a popularly elected official of the Workers' Socialist Party called the National Socialist Party became known as Nazis. It was a man named Adolf Hitler who got elected because he blamed it all on one ethnic group, the Jews. We have somebody running for office today that's trying to blame things on Hispanics and on the other people who are of another religion, and that's going to be a very dangerous kind of proposition.
Right.
I'm not going to mention names, but the parallels are a bit frightening to me because of what happened with the Holocaust, where it was supposed to be, Judenfrei, Jew-free.
Mm-hmm.
That was the state to give Lebensraum, to give life room to the Aryan people, the chosen people. Excuse me, but go on.
That's a perfect segue into the next level of consciousness, which is pride.
Okay, this
And we're
segues
seeing
in.
a lot of that
right
now in the political race that we're
But
all
there can be
watching.
false pride and
Absolutely.
healthy pride,
Absolutely.
too.
And
I take
pride-
pride in the way I look. I take
Correct.
pride in the way my shoes are clean.
Pride is a higher level of
I
awareness.
take pride in my teeth being
Correct. So
clean.
pride it calibrates at 175, and even though the ego is very much involved in this level, it still feels very good in contrast to those lower levels we talked about. However, pride is very often contingent upon outside approval or acceptance. And if you think about a child that learns to tie their shoes or write their letters, they're really wanting that confirmation from the parents or the teacher.
But let me take
approval.
some of these words. You said ego. Now, if you take the Freudian paradigm, ego means consciousness, right?
According to Freud, yes.
Yeah. And superego means consciousness of others.
Right.
Huh?
Right. The greater consciousness.
That's right.
And that's what we're talking about here.
That's what I want to get on to.
Yeah. So the next level up is courage, and courage calibrates at 200 consistently. And this is the level of change. Once a person actually arrives at the level of courage, they're able to make decisions. They're able to see things differently. They're willing to take risks. They're able to expand, and there is growth. And this is when true power first appears at the level of courage. This is when someone's life really begins to look and feel different. It's more interesting. It looks like there is possibility. There's an equal exchange of giving and receiving energy when someone is at the level of courage. That means they're willing to do some things in order to receive. They're willing to give in order to receive. And that is when everything begins to change. And that's when we begin to see a lot of the real productive events occur. When people move into that place of courage, obstacles that might have been insurmountable at those lower levels suddenly seem attainable and even are exciting.
Okay, now, when you talk about courage, I'm then going to segue on to my friend Mugabe. I know something about that you don't know, and I'm going to access something in his experience. You mentioned also with courage. Often courage has to do with confronting what might be life-threatening. And
Correct.
we also have in Hawkins' paradigm and his examples that people who've gone through life-threatening or life-endangering situations and literally have come very close to losing life, as I have on about 3 or 4 occasions, see a whole new awareness, a whole different. And I remember something that Mugabe shared with a group of people that were trying to get well, and were talking about how do I get out of this state. And he talked about a point where he was considering hanging himself at Soledad. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Would you please talk about that
Yes,
and what happened in your life and your consciousness at that moment? You were in Soledad prison. You'd been in prison for a while. You were in a solitary cell, right?
Yes.
And you saw no hope, and you put together a noose. Go on.
Yes, I was in Soledad, like Big Ben was saying. I was in Soledad, like Big Ben was saying. And it came a time I was depressed. I was locked up in this cell, wasn't talking to anyone, by myself, and I was just at the lowest point. And I made a noose, and I tied it around my neck, and I put it in between the doors. And I called the sheriff at the time, the prison guard, and he would unlock the door and come in and check on me. And I know exactly how to do it, and so at the instant I called him to do it, I snatched it back. You know, at that
So that it wouldn't pull you out and hang you.
That conscious, I become a conscious aware of everything just happening.
At that
right
instant.
At that instant.
That was an epiphany.
That
like,
was the time that I was going to make a change.
Okay.
But to get back to it is being conscious aware. All of these getting this conscious aware of life and death.
Yeah.
You know, what do I really want?
Uh-huh.
I became conscious of making a decision for me. You know,
And that took courage.
Yeah.
You took.
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
courageous for you to make that decision to not hang yourself.
and to see life in a whole new dimension. Well, could you go on with this then?
Sure. So with the
When did you
level
get
of
that?
courage, that is when you move into your true power, and that's what Mugabe did when he
Your what?
decided
Your true
power,
Your real
your
power.
authentic power.
The authentic power.
Correct.
Authenticity is the title of my best book.
Not cutting you off, but I was thinking about also back in my junior high days, seeing a person that wasn't African American, he's white, and he made a decision for us to be friends. We both connect. We both connected.
Okay.
That took courage.
But to walk outside of that gate of that the outside forces, for him to make that decision and for me to make that decision, and we come together and right today we still friends and we still have contact with each other, and in our process become conscious of recognizing when someone become conscious and you become conscious and y'all both click. And the outside forces don't have. I can see the power behind that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you remember the statement that Bobby Kennedy made at Martin Luther King's funeral? My brother was also killed by a white man. Do you remember that? That was amazing. Courage, huh? That was incredible. Go on. Anyway.
Yes, so at the level of courage, everything really begins to change. There's a dramatic difference in outlook, and it changes someone's worldview. And once someone steps into that level of courage, even just one time, they're changed permanently, as you were.
Do you think it stays into that person, you know, regardless on his walk?
And this is my opinion, my opinion is that once you move into it, it's always there for you, and you can access it again anytime you need it.
Totally agree.
You may fall back down, you may slip, but you've been there. You've been there.
You recognize it.
I also, when I'm in the prisons, I'm just going to get very specific. I go to the prison a couple of times. I've been doing it for 51 years, since 1965, and I say to the men, how many of you here pray? Well, what is praying? Help me.
Yes.
And meditation. Then you listen and find out how. And this is a way of constantly moving up, up in consciousness, right?
Right, exactly. So the next level up on the scale of consciousness that Dr. Hawkins developed through all of this research that he did was neutrality. And that calibrates at 250. Neutrality is a place where there's a lot of openness. People are relatively unattached to outcomes. There's flexibility. There is expansion there. And this also at neutrality is the level of safety. And this is a place where people really need to be allowed to be. And that is one of the things that the media, in my opinion, the media is actually trying to keep us from moving into neutrality and that level of safety.
Constantly undermining that what would establish a neutrality.
Correct.
Yeah.
When people are at
They're
the
trying
at
to
this level,
polarize.
right, and they love it. It
Well,
sells.
No, but that's the pay. It's the payoff.
Correct.
That's the money. Yeah.
Yeah, so in neutrality, people at this level are not tied up in competition, judgment, or control. Very important. The next level up is willingness. It calibrates at 310, and this is the gateway to higher levels, to more rapid growth, more societal and economic change.
Willingness. I like that.
Correct. More self-correcting behaviors,
Voluntad.
more success, more willingness to take next steps. The next level up is acceptance, and major transformation occurs at this level. And this is where one believes that one is actually responsible for one's own life, one's own happiness, one's own engagement in life on life's terms without an agenda.
May I just interject?
Sure.
Mugabe and I both practice a 12-step program in which we do a full step and then we share it with a sponsor, and the sponsor points out to us where we are actually responsible and we must accept our responsibility. Go on.
Correct. The next level up is reason, which calibrates at 400. And this
Wow.
is where intelligence and rationality rise to the forefront. And there's increased capacity for knowledge and understanding, education, particularly a focus on science and mathematics, those kind of concrete disciplines. And this is very interesting because reason itself, paradoxically, is the major block to reaching higher levels of consciousness. Because people that are really caught up in reason want information and proof, and data is of utmost importance.
Let me
So reason
interject
itself doesn't provide truth.
that I have been teaching philosophy since 1965. The last degree, PhD, Doctor of Philosophy, I received in England from Cambridge. And in my philosophy classes, we talk about all of the processes of reason up until we get into modern existentialism, which then says that however far you go with reason, you find that it's all absurd.
It
And suddenly
stops.
you embrace the absurd and celebrate life in all its dimensions, all right?
Right,
Yeah.
Whether
right.
reasonable or not.
I also
Total acceptance.
also, reason. But once you
A leap
the
of
gut,
faith.
the gut inside. I was
Uh-huh.
always taught that gut inside of you, that place,
That place
spiritual
inside.
of you
Uh-huh.
makes determination. And once you become conscious of that,
Mm-hmm.
without any reason, without any facts, it's inside of you.
Yeah.
And once you connect and get conscious of that, and it's been passed in my tradition, African community, for years and years and years, for decades and decades, that listen to that gut. Listen
Yeah.
to that inner part
And that
of
is
yourself.
the inner voice. Well, now, can
Yes.
you sort of sum it? We're running a
Yes,
little bit out of time. I
this-
want you to kind
he
of...
just actually stepped right into the most important
want
point
you
I
to-
want to make.
Right, because we've got just minutes left.
500 is the level of love.
Okay. And then?
And the love calibrates at 500, and this has nothing to do with looks, romance, mass media,
it's
nothing
pure.
external.
Agape, caritas.
This is the level of love that is unconditional, unchanging, and permanent. It is
Permanent.
our heart. It's not intellectual. It focuses on the goodness of life and all its expressions, and this is the level of true happiness.
Well, you said something about the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yes.
Could you say what you said to me?
Sure. As they were doing all of this research, they calibrated and checked a lot of books, and one of the books that they actually tested was the big book of AA.
Alcoholics
And
Anonymous.
It calibrated at 700.
700?
Yes. And that's because it has such a high level of understanding, awareness, and love within it. It's filled with stories of people who pulled themselves out of those very lower level emotional states and life experiences and raised themselves into a higher state,
And
a
I've
state
got
of
to
love.
say, my friend Mugabe has done this, and he serves others. He has halfway houses. I go to prisons. I serve others. This is the way we maintain it. But I'm not going to be a Krishnamurti. I don't think I'm a bodhisattva like the Dalai Lama or a Rinpoche or a Tulku or a Jesus Christ or any of those characters who are up there around, 800 to 1,000.
That's right.
But it's something to strive for.
Absolutely.
And if we know what the factors are, if we know the way the game is rigged, we will break free. we will listen to that, as Mugabe says, that inner voice,
Right.
right?
Absolutely.
We've come up to, I'd like to know, would you just like to make a closing remark here,
Yes.
Mugabe, and then over to Melinda?
I'm just happy and blessed to be here today. Here got a lot of good information for myself, and again, congratulations. And I just thank KUHS for all the things they're doing here in Hot Springs. This is a blessing to come here and discuss things with the public and get information, and it's just a blessing from all the volunteers. And Zach, my brother, in the booth back there. It's just a blessing just to be here. And thank you again for letting me share a little bit of my life. And y'all have a blessed day today.
And of course, I've segued, I love that word, along with the Renaissance women, and I believe we have a Renaissance woman here. I would love it if you would make some comment, because I always believe in the feminine. I've been on a goddessy all my life. I believe if I can access my feminine, intuitive spirituality, I may have some hope. Could you make a remark, though?
Sure. I also am very much appreciative of the opportunity to be here today and share this incredible information that everyone needs to have. I heard something that the Dalai Lama said, which kind of has stayed with me. He said that Western women are going to save this planet. And I tend to disagree. I think that it's all women. If you know anything about the Kiva Foundation, you know that the women that operate the Kiva Foundation and the women who are the benefactors are really making massive changes in those developing nations. And so I think it's women's time. It's time for us to step up and just really let everyone know.
Well, my goddess in America is Michelle Obama, and I think it's so amusing that person who was representing another person quoted her almost verbatim. And I think it's, well, you're following a good model, probably the most saintly. And when Barack Obama was asked, what does he want for his daughters? He said, I just tell them just two things. Be kind, be useful. Well, I think that this is the kind of program, KUHS, the solar-powered radio station, 97.9, and what Big Ben and company have been wanting to provide. And so I'm going to flash us back to and say, till next week, folks, Big Ben and company, everything is sometimes.